And I like soft pretzels.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming to the first event of our conference on the spirit of commercial republics, money, morals, and music. This is a two-day event that begins this late afternoon with a lecture and continues tomorrow with several lectures and music. This event, of course, is in the Sullivan Room. Our final event, which begins at 4 o'clock tomorrow evening, by Mary Sue Morrow of the University of Cincinnati, will also be in this room, but all of the other lectures will be in room 720. And after the morning sessions, there will be a free lunch. So please recommend that to all of your students. And that's why Tom Merrill decided that he would come and be a speaker, because he heard that there was a free lunch. We have a very distinguished group of speakers at our conference, and I think it will be quite an extraordinary affair. Our first speaker this evening is Professor David Womersley. Professor Womersley is the Thomas Wharton Chair of English Literature at the University of Oxford. Yes, we'll get to the Cambridge in a minute. He's a professorial fellow at St. Catherine's College at Oxford. He took his undergraduate degree and his graduate degree at Trinity College, which is in Cambridge. I don't know who he roots for when Cambridge rose against Oxford.
I'm making my mind at Hammersmith Bridge.
He's always on the side of the victor, I have no doubt about that. I've known David, we were figuring this out for over 20 years. He works on the long 18th century, people like Edward Gibbon and Jonathan Swift. He's written on Andrew Marvell, his great interest in Pope and Edmund Burke and Samuel Johnson, and almost everyone else in the 18th century. He's interested in historiography. He writes limpidly and beautifully. He's a scholar's scholar. He has put together the edition of Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He has put together something that is beyond the edition of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, the text of which is some 225 pages. David's edition is 2 pages short of 800. And the difference is David's remarkable scholarship. He's a wonderful teacher. He's a wonderful raconteur. In 2009, he was elected to be a fellow to the British Academy, which is no small feat. I was trying to recollect whether Roosevelt University has ever had a fellow from the British Academy speak at our university. And there's only one possibility that came to mind. So we'll test your knowledge. I think it was Harold Lasky, the British Academy? Very probably. So he was here in, I think, 1948 or 1949. David's work is worth looking at. His first book was The Transformation of Gibbon's book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which came out in 1988, and it changed the face of Gibbon's scholarship. Prior to that, the dominant reading of Gibbon's history was that it was one continuous, coherent work, but David argued with great felicity that its intention changed through the course of the volumes from 1776 through 1788. He is the world's preeminent scholar on Edward Gibbon, and we're exceedingly honored that he's come to Roosevelt University to talk on the subject of Gibbon and commerce. So please join me in welcoming David here.
Thank you, Stuart. Well, it's a great pleasure and it's a great honour to be asked to give this lecture, particularly on the immensely rich subject of Gibbon and commerce. Well, all I can do this afternoon is draw for you the broadest outlines and indicate the most obvious features of this wonderful theme. But before I do so, I'd first like to thank my friend Stuart Warner, who invited me to speak today, and also the generous sponsors of the whole conference, namely the Jack Miller Centre and the John Templeton Foundation. So in 1792, Gibbon had a rare disagreement with the man who was by then his friend of longer standing, John Baker Holroyd, Lord Sheffield. The two men fell out over what should happen to Gibbon's library after his death. Sheffield had suggested that the collection should be preserved entire and housed at his residence in Sussex, Sheffield Place. As he wrote to Gibbon on the 14th of May, "The annihilation of your books by French revolutionaries," Gibbon at this point is living in Lausanne, and the French Revolution is raging not very far from his house. "The annihilation of your books might be a proper judgment on you for the damned, parson-minded, inglorious idea of leaving books to be sold." Sheffield was a rabid anti-clerical. There was no stronger term of blame in his lexicon than parson-minded, I think. And of course, he used it knowing that it would go Gibbon. Leaving books to be sold, a trumpery fellow that after having made a good collection had not the idea of keeping them together by leaving them to Sheffield Place, where they would involve the books already there, and the whole be handed down seris nepotibus as the Gibbonian library. I could hardly contain my indignation when you mentioned your snivelling notion. Well, Gibbon was having none of this. He insisted that his book should be sold after his death and explained his preference. "I'm a friend to the circulation of property of every kind. And besides the pecuniary advantage of my poor heirs, I consider a public sale as the most laudable method of disposing of it. From such sales my books were chiefly collected, and when I can no longer use them, they will be again culled by various buyers according to the measure of their wants and means." Well, in this exchange, Gibbon appears modern, enlightened, commercially minded in the sense of not being enthralled to outmoded ideas and prejudices about property, and in consequence fully alive to what in the Decline and Fall he had called the mutual benefits of commerce. He knew well that, as he again had put it, the business of life is multiplied by the extent of commerce, and he rejoiced in that happy fact about the society in which he lived. Unlike Sheffield, who, however, was by far the better practical man of business, Gibbon understood that human betterment might be promoted by commerce, in both its now more familiar and narrower sense of trade, but also in that larger sense of the world, of which the 18th century was so fond, meaning general human interaction, be it intellectual, religious, or even sexual. In the Decline and Fall, Gibbon had used the word commerce to refer to all those areas of human life. Gibbon had solid reasons to be grateful to commerce. The family fortune, the remnants of which would sustain him in his life of scholarship and literary composition, had been amassed through trade. Gibbon's grandfather had been a contractor to the armies of William III, then later to the court of Madrid. Bolingbroke is said to have remarked admiringly that he had never conversed with a man who more clearly understood the commerce and finances of England. In 1716, when his fortune stood at £60,000, a huge sum in the 18th century, Gibbon's grandfather became a director of the South Sea Company. When the bubble burst in 1720, old Mr. Gibbon's fortune was virtually wiped out by a fine of £96,000 imposed by Parliament. But by the time of his death in 1736, he had, as Gibbon puts it, erected the edifice of a new fortune not much inferior to the first. And Gibbon's mother's family, the Portons, were also successful merchants. However, and despite these promising beginnings, the Gibbons were to form no great commercial dynasty. Gibbon's father inherited none of his own father's financial acumen, and Gibbon himself was never attracted to a life of trade. By the time of his death in 1794, the family wealth had been run down through disposals and consumption, and the residual value of Gibbon's estate was a comfortable but unspectacular £26,000. But if Gibbon had not been drawn to the practice of commerce, nevertheless the subject of commerce was of very great interest to him. A full account of Gibbon's intellectual engagement with what he called, in a letter to his friend Adam Smith, the great objects of trade and revenue, would have to include a review of the broad discursive context of the study of trade since the late 17th century, when political arithmetic had first become a subject of inquiry, some assessment of the extent and nature of the discussion of commercial topics in intellectual circles in the Pays de Vaud in the years leading up to and during Gibbon's first two periods of residence in Switzerland, 1753-58 and then 1763-64. Gibbon's reflections on commerce in both its broad and narrow senses in the writings he published before the Decline and Fall, particularly the Essay on the Study of Literature of 1761. And finally, of how he drew on and transformed his sources for the commerce of antiquity when writing the Decline and Fall itself. Sources ranging from general histories such as Pierre Daniel Huet's Histoire du commerce et de la navigation des anciens of 1716, Ferdinando Galiani's Dialogue sur le commerce des blés of 1770, Adam Anderson's massive two-volume History of Commerce of 1764, works by Joseph de Guignes on the commerce of the French with the Levant, as well as more specialist technical works such as Berman's Study of Roman Taxation, Vettigalia Populi Romani, 1734, Arbuthnot's Table of Coins, Weights and Measures of 1727, and of course for the volumes of Decline and Fall published in 1781 and 1788, Adam Smith's Magisterial, and in parts very historical, The Wealth of Nations of 1776. Wealth of Nations published just under 3 weeks after the first volume of Decline and Fall in 1776. So Gibbon certainly couldn't have read Adam Smith in print before writing his first volume, though they had known each other in 1775, so it's possible that they'd spoken about those subjects. Anyway, I obviously can't do that in 40 minutes. But what I can do this afternoon is address what I take to be the heart of the topic, namely Gibbon's relationship with the writings on commerce of the Scottish Enlightenment. These writings were familiar to Gibbon, just as their authors were well known to him personally. Reviewing the social and economic consequences of the Crusades, Gibbon commented in a footnote that, on this interesting subject, progress of society in Europe, a strong ray of philosophic light has broke from Scotland in our own times, and it is with private as well as public regard that I repeat the names of Hume, Robertson, and Adam Smith, all of course personal friends of Gibbon. But regard, let us be clear, does not necessarily imply full agreement. It's surely possible to respect, even to admire, and yet to differ. Two questions immediately arise. What role had these Scottish philosopher-historians allotted to commerce in the progress of society from barbarism to civility? And secondly, how well did their philosophic perceptions accord with the insights and conclusions of their more purely historically minded English friend? Well, in Book 3 of The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith remarked on the long-term social benefits which had flowed from the growth of commerce. Commerce and manufactures gradually introduced order and good government, and with them, the liberty and security of individuals, he said, adding that Hume, as far as he knew, was so far the only writer who had taken notice of this important factor in the progress of society. In essays such as Of Commerce, of Refinement in the Arts, of Civil Liberty, of Eloquence, and of the rise and progress of the arts and sciences, Hume had indeed advanced a series of arguments contending that commerce had the power to improve, socialize, and perfect the human personality, notwithstanding the recent skepticism of Rousseau on that score. And furthermore, that commerce eventually strengthened the liberty, security of property, and regular government on which it had initially depended to take root. Well, Hume's optimistic, Epicurean, and anti-Machiavellian account of commerce was eagerly adopted by other Scottish thinkers. And let me illustrate how thoroughly and promptly it permeated their intellectual world with a quotation from the third of that triumvirate of writers, Gibbon associated with the breaking of this strong ray of philosophic light from north of the border, namely the clergyman and historian William Robertson. In the View of the Progress of Society in Europe that Robertson printed as the introductory section of his History of Charles V, 1769, Robertson advanced the textbook Humean argument and then concluded with this resonant tribute to the civilizing and humanizing power of commerce. Commerce tends to wear off those prejudices which maintain distinction and animosity between nations. It softens and polishes the manners of men. It unites them by one of the strongest of all ties, the desire of supplying their mutual wants. It disposes them to peace by establishing in every state an order of citizens bound by their interests to be the guardians of public tranquility. As soon as the commercial spirit begins to acquire vigor and to gain an ascendant in any society, we discover a new genius in its policy, its alliances, its wars, and its negotiations. In proportion as commerce made its way into the different countries of Europe, they successively turned their attention to those objects and adopted those manners which occupy and distinguish polished nations. Although that formulation of the benefits of commerce occurs in a work of history, it's surely striking that it's phrased in so unhistorical a manner. The operation of commerce is presented almost as a law of nature. At any time, in any place, in any society, so Robertson suggests, it must tend to have these benign effects. Well, Gibbon was both attracted to the philosophic mode and suspicious of it. The characteristic hesitation arose when he was writing in chapter 17 of Decline and Fall about imperial taxation under Constantine. He said, "The obscure millions of a great empire have much less to dread from the cruelty than from the avarice of their masters, and their humble happiness is principally affected by the grievance of excessive taxes, which gently pressing on the wealthy, descend with accelerated weight on the meaner and more indigent classes of society." And at that point he pauses to introduce a strikingly modern and explicitly philosophic axiom relating the burden of taxation to politics, which he takes from Montesquieu's Esprit des Lois, book 13, chapter 12. It says, an ingenious philosopher, Montesquieu, has calculated the universal measure of the public impositions by the degrees of freedom and servitude, and ventures to assert that, according to an invariable law of nature, it must always increase with the former and diminish in a just proportion to the latter. Alas, if only it were so. For as Gibbon notes, however Montesquieu may claim that this is a law drawn from nature, which never varies, in fact, the history of the Roman Empire provided abundant evidence to the contrary. But this reflection, which would tend to alleviate the miseries of despotism, is contradicted at least by the history of the Roman Empire, which accuses the same princes of despoiling the Senate of its authority and the provinces of their wealth. It had been the particular misfortune of the subjects of the later empire to be exposed both to despotism and high taxation. Gibbon's tendency to demur at the generalizations of philosophers on the subject of commerce is not principally, I think, a function of a difference in intellectual temperament between him and them, though that may be part of it. More fundamentally, it was a consequence of the paradoxical situation in which, as the historian of the later empire, his attraction to the insights and what we might call the intellectual style of his Scottish friends had placed him, namely that of being obliged to describe and analyse the commercial life of pre-commercial societies. Philosophical history entailed a relocation of attention from the splendid to the more useful parts of history, as Gibbon put it. The history of commerce was thus something that a philosophical historian would need and wish to include within the scope of his work. Gibbon was eager to connect questions of economic organisation and activity to the political and military topics which had hitherto dominated Roman history. And many examples could be given, particularly from the later chapters of the history, of how his imagination was warmed when he reflected on the commerce of antiquity. Economic history, he knew, was central to the story he had to tell. As he says, in the course of this history, we shall be too often summoned to explain the land tax, the capitation, and the heavy contributions of corn, wine, oil, and meat, which were exacted from the provinces for the use of the court, the army, and the capital. But to refocus the history of the later Roman Empire so as to include its economic and its commercial life was beset with problems. The first problem was lack of evidence. Gibbon repeatedly complains that when it comes to the trade and finance of the ancient world, he is reduced to working with what he called a few imperfect hints and the faint glimmerings of doubtful and scattered lights. He's tantalized by the loss of precious documents. History, he says, has never perhaps suffered a greater or more irreparable injury than the loss of the curious register bequeathed by Augustus to the Senate, in which that experienced prince so accurately balanced the revenues and the expenses of the Roman Empire. And nor did the situation much improve when Gibbon came closer to the present, when he moved on into his volumes devoted to the Byzantine Empire. I must repeat the complaint, he says, that the vague and scanty memorials of the times will not afford any just estimate of the taxes, the revenue, and the resources of the Greek Empire. Well, Hume, too, of course, had been aware of this lack of evidence, and I've put on the handout a photograph of a page of early memoranda from the Hume manuscripts in the National Library of Scotland, in which we can follow Hume as he combs ancient and modern historians for stray facts of economic significance that they've included. But the thinness of evidence pressed less hard on a philosopher constructing general arguments than it did on an historian whose narrative and analysis demanded fuller materials. Well, when he can, Gibbon makes up for this dearth of information and will disengage the commercial or financial significance of a detail of the past which, at first glance, may seem to have little to do with trade and money. For instance, in AD 193, Severus was able to claim the throne by marching his troops from the Danube to the Tiber in only 56 days. Gibbon is quick to bring out what this military feat reveals about the commercial life and infrastructure of the empire. And as he does so, he converts the splendid, the military and the dynastic, into the economic and commercially useful. The almost incredible expedition of Severus, he says, proves at once the plenty of provisions produced by agriculture and commerce, the goodness of the roads, the discipline of the legions, and the indolent, subdued temper of the provinces. Or another example, when Braga, the capital of the Suevi, was being besieged by Theodoric and the Goths in AD 456, Gibbon again is very alert and very quick to spot the nugget of commercial information which is contained within the attempted escape by sea of the king of the Suevi. He says, from the design of the king of the Suevi, it is evident that the navigation from the ports of Galicia to the Mediterranean was known and practiced. The ships of Bracara or Braga cautiously steered along the coast without daring to lose themselves in the Atlantic. So what in the hands of a lesser historian might have remained as a comparatively inert detail in the military history of the barbarians, Gibbon exploits more imaginatively to illuminate the trade routes of antiquity. To some extent, the lack of evidence about the commercial life of late antiquity was due to the loss of contemporary documents, such as Augustus's memorandum on the finances of the empire. Gibbon also knew that the subject of commerce had not been of great intellectual interest to the people of the centuries he's studying, and that therefore they tended not to collect information about it. It wasn't just loss. This information had never been gathered to begin with. The period of his history was, as he says, a time when the principles of commerce were imperfectly understood, and at Rome, commerce was always held in contempt. This leads to the second problem that Gibbon faced. The mentalité of the people he's studying was only imperfectly commercial, and as a result, in late antiquity, the impact of commercial activity on manners and social life differed curiously from the predictions of Gibbon's Scottish friends. So in chapter 31, Gibbon followed Hume in identifying, or seems to follow Hume, in identifying the mercantile fractions of society as a source of social stability. He says, in populous cities, which are the seat of commerce and manufactures, the middle ranks of inhabitants who derive their subsistence from the dexterity or labour of their hands are commonly the most prolific, the most useful, and in that sense, the most respectable part of the community. But then he goes on immediately to point out how the past had veered away from fulfilling this Humean axiom of social theory. He says, but the plebeians of Rome, who disdained such sedentary and servile arts, the arts of commerce and manufactures, had been oppressed from the earliest times by the weight of debt and usury, and the husbandman during the term of his military service was obliged to abandon the cultivation of his farm. The lands of Italy, which had been originally divided among the families of free and indigent proprietors, were insensibly purchased or usurped by the avarice of the nobles, and in the age which preceded the fall of the Republic, it was computed that only 2,000 citizens were possessed of any independent substance. In other words, the economic life of the centuries to which Gibbon was narrating in Decline and Fall had been subtly unlike that of his own times. The interval between the economic ideas of the men who lived through the events that Gibbon narrates and studies and those of his own day was something to which he'd already drawn attention in his first volume. He wrote The Darkness of the Middle Ages, by which Gibbon means a sort of period of time between the sort of heyday of antiquity and the revival of learning in Europe. The darkness of the Middle Ages ensured a favourable reception to every tale of wonder, and the revival of learning gave new vigour to hope and suggested more specious arts of deception. Philosophy, with the aid of experience, has at length banished the study of alchemy, and the present age, however desirous of riches, is content to seek them by the humbler means of commerce and industry. So it's not just that there's more commerce and industry around now, it's that commerce and industry have somehow been promoted up the scale of human activities. Well, how precisely then had the economic life of what Gibbon calls the Middle Ages differed from that of the 18th century? Well, as we've seen, the commercial life of those centuries didn't always display the typologies of character and consequence which the new Scottish Science of Society had postulated as typical. Not only did these centuries differ from modernity on the surface, they also threw down a more profound challenge to the Epicurean philosophy of Hume and Adam Smith, and the liberating role they had assigned in that philosophy to economic activity. Because somehow the economic life of antiquity kept taking wrong turnings. Originally, as Gibbon says, the real property of Italy had been divided among the families of free and indigent proprietors, but then a catastrophe had intervened, albeit gradually and invisibly. These lands, originally dispersed among the community, were insensibly purchased or usurped by the avarice of the nobles. So history showed that it was possible to move from an almost optimal distribution of property throughout society to a much less optimal monopolistic agglomeration of assets. The notion implicit in the thought of Hume, at least, that the intellectual and material benefits of enlightenment and commercial enlightenment, once obtained, could never be lost, which Gibbon, in some more sanguine moments, could prevail on himself to share, was, however, not corroborated at every point by the historical record. Economic progress was not a ratchet. It was a two-way street. In the confused centuries of decline and fall, men had moved up and down the scale of commercial advancement in ways unpredicted by the Scottish philosophers. Gibbon made a similar point in respect of the French city of Arles, which he characterized as a seat of government and commerce, and which supplied an example of progressive economic and political order, which, however, the imperial administration declined to follow and perhaps didn't understand. In one of those counterfactual moments, to which he doesn't always refuse himself, Gibbon speculated on, as we might put it, what could have happened had the emperors of Rome had the good fortune instead to be Scottish philosophers. He says, if such an institution, the Assembly of the Seven Provinces of Gaul, which met in Arles, which gave the people an interest in their own government, had been universally established by Trajan or the Antonines, the seeds of public wisdom and virtue might have been cherished and propagated in the Empire of Rome. The privileges of the subject would have secured the throne of the monarch. The abuses of an arbitrary administration might have been prevented in some degree or corrected by the interposition of these representative assemblies. And the country would have been defended against a foreign enemy by the arms of natives and freemen. Under the mild and generous influence of liberty, the Roman Empire might have remained invincible and immortal. Or if its excessive magnitude and the instability of human affairs had opposed such perpetual continuance, its vital and constituent members might have separately preserved their vigour and independence. So key elements of enlightened civil society, the creation of a broad and educated political class, constitutional monarchy, a military establishment militia-like in spirit, even if permanently embodied, these elements of enlightened society might have arrived some 1,500 years earlier than in fact they did. And the wasteful 1.5 millennium long interval which had postponed their arrival might have been avoided. Gibbon is pleased when he can point to instances when the progress of society in Europe had followed the course assigned to it by his philosophical Scottish friends, as for instance in a detail of the history of his adopted country, Switzerland. At Zug in Switzerland, idolatry still prevailed in the year 613. St. Columban and St. Gall were the apostles of that rude country, and the latter founded an hermitage which has swelled into an ecclesiastical principality and a populous city, the seat of freedom and commerce. But he knows very well that this happy direction of travel from bigotry and primitivism to liberty, enlightenment and commerce was not the only story for which the past had supplied evidence. If the Scottish philosophers had conceived of commerce as an historical vector in terms which Gibbon eventually found to be too simple, so too had they failed to take the full measure of its impact on men's manners. As we've seen, Robertson, following Hume, had ascribed to commerce an almost miraculous power to soften and refine the human personality and to encourage men to follow the paths of peace. Commerce, he says, tends to wear off those prejudices which maintain distinction and animosity between nations. It softens and polishes the manners of men. It unites them by one of the strongest of all ties, the desire of supplying their mutual wants. It disposes them to peace by establishing in every state an order of citizens bound by their interests to be the guardians of public tranquility. For Gibbon, however, the testimony of the past concerning the moral impact of commerce was much more equivocal. The Rhodians, who Gibbon tells us flourished by the liberty of commerce, nevertheless happily employed torture. And it's possible that Gibbon took a mischievous pleasure in illustrating the insecurely grounded exuberance of his Scottish friends on the subject of the moral benefits of commerce with a native Scottish example, which pointed in precisely the opposite direction. If, in the neighbourhood of the commercial and literary town of Glasgow, as he puts it, a race of cannibals has really existed, we may contemplate in the period of the Scottish history the opposite extremes of savage and civilised life. It wasn't only in Scotland, however, that commerce had sometimes failed to work its moral magic. Under Kublai Khan, China seemed to have made important strides towards the goal of human betterment. Under the reign of Kublai, letters and commerce, peace and justice were restored. The Great Canal of 500 miles was opened from Nankin to the capital. He fixed his residence at Peking and displayed in his court the magnificence of the greatest monarch of Asia. But this was only part of the Chinese picture. Elsewhere on that canvas, Gibbon found evidence of some of the most stubborn moral barbarisms, namely credulity and a cruel indifference to the suffering of others, existing without apparent tension alongside commercial refinement. Yet this learned prince declined from the pure and simple religion of his great ancestor. He sacrificed to the idol foe, and his blind attachment to the lamas of Tibet and the bonzes of China provoked the censure of the disciples of Confucius. His successors polluted the palace with a crowd of eunuchs, physicians, and astrologers, while 13 million of their subjects were consumed in the provinces by famine. And if, in late antiquity, economic refinement could exist alongside moral barbarism, so might economic backwardness be found in those who had attained moral refinement. Gibbon's friend, Adam Smith, attacked the French taxation system of his own day as the most wasteful in modern Europe, largely on account of its reliance on farmer generals, that's to say people who bought the right to raise the taxation from the king. an institution which, as Smith describes it, both reduced the yield of taxation and increased popular resentment of it. Well, Gibbon pauses in puzzlement over the insolent vexation of the farmers of the revenue, as he puts it, in the Roman Empire. For it is somewhat singular that in every age the best and wisest of the Roman governors persevered in this pernicious method of collecting the principal branches, at least, of the excise and customs. These instances serve as reminders that the progress of society from barbarism to refinement and commerce was neither necessary nor ubiquitous. Rather, as it had happened in Western Europe, it had been a wonderful and precious accident, one in the teeth of stubbornly adverse factors, and which, from the many aborted earlier tentative steps in that direction which Gibbon had come across, could easily itself have been thwarted or crushed. The historian is therefore less likely than the philosopher to take for granted the comforts, the security, and the liberty of a modern world of opulence, politeness, and trade. Late on in the Decline and Fall, Gibbon reflected in a general way on these moments of what, from the standpoint of the 18th century, might look like simple obtuseness on the part of our ancestors, and the childish ease with which they seem to have been distracted from their own true commercial interests. Why could they not see that they needed to act in this way rather than that way? So Gibbon says, the operation of prejudice and interest, a fascinating conjunction, I think, is often disturbed by the sallies of ungovernable passion. The Indian who fells the tree that he may gather the fruit, and the Arab who plunders the caravans of commerce, are actuated by the same impulse of savage nature, which overlooks the future in the present and relinquishes for momentary rapine the long and secure possession of the most important blessings. Footnote then refers us to the celebrated evocation of the spirit of despotism from the Esprit des Lois, which Gibbon has paraphrased in that passage. When the savages of Louisiana want fruit, they cut the tree and gather the fruit. That is despotic government. To which Gibbon then adds the comment, broadening despotism from a political system to a temperamental disposition, and passion and ignorance are always despotic. Let me discuss just one final respect in which the commercial life of antiquity had failed to conform to the generalizations of Hume and Robertson and Smith. The Scots had tended to oppose commerce to war and religion. Commerce, productive of the milder sociability characteristic of modernity, war and religion, supportive of the violence and irrationality characteristic of antiquity. And in this they would be followed by later thinkers. Thomas Paine would contrast what he called the old and new systems of government in precisely these terms. He says, the former supports itself by keeping up a system of war, the latter promotes a system of peace as the true means of enriching a nation. The one encourages national prejudices, the other promotes universal society as the means of universal commerce. Early in the next century, Benjamin Constant would proclaim in his lecture on ancient and modern liberty, war is all impulse, commerce calculation. Hence it follows that an age must come in which commerce replaces war. We have reached that age. 4 years after the Battle of Waterloo. Strange thing to say. We can talk about that maybe. But Gibbon stands aside from that opposition of war and religion on the one hand, and commerce on the other, and he tends much more to place these three historical factors close together. Considering the spread of Christianity, Gibbon noted that the various accidents of war and commerce might indeed diffuse, interesting verb, an imperfect knowledge of the gospel. And at the end of the third volume of Decline and Fall, he wrote, since the first discovery of the arts, war, commerce, and religious zeal have diffused, again he turns to that word, among the savages of the old and new world, these inestimable gifts. They have been successively propagated. They can never be lost. So commerce in its large sense of human interaction can be promoted by the antagonists, war and dogmatic religion, of commerce in its narrow sense of trade. For the historian, commerce, war and religion are all vectors of human interaction, and thus all have the potency to develop the commerce of mankind in its broader sense. For the historian, the character of the motivation which brought about the interaction, aggressive or peaceable, bigoted or rational, is comparatively unimportant. What matters much more is the simple fact of whether or not interaction took place. Here we might return to another moment when Gibbon implicitly contrasts the political and moral nature of modern Europe with its ancient precursor. He says, Europe is now divided into 12 powerful though unequal kingdoms, 3 respectable commonwealths, and a variety of smaller though independent states. The chances of royal and ministerial talents are multiplied, at least with the number of its rulers, and a Julian or Semiramis may reign in the north, while Arcadius and Honorius slumber on the thrones of the House of Bourbon. A remark of which Louis XVI took grave offence. The abuses of tyranny are restrained by the mutual influence of fear and shame. Republics have acquired order and stability. Monarchies have imbibed the principles of freedom, or at least of moderation. And some sense of honour and justice is introduced into the most effective constitutions by the general manners of the time. So the arrival of modernity has coincided with, been marked by, the hybridization of political forms. Republics, typically the most unstable of political forms, have acquired order and stability. Monarchies have imbibed the principles of freedom, or at least of moderation. At the level of political typology, there has been commerce in its larger, more expansive form. Modern Europe has been made safe for commerce in its narrower, more technical sense of trade, because it has embraced and in turn been shaped by commerce in its broader sense of interaction and hybridization. And war and religion, Gibbon suggests, have also played their part in that process. Well, those 2 last quotations were both taken from the general observations on the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, a sort of little small essay which Gibbon adds as a pendant to the end of his 3rd volume. And in his memoirs, Gibbon tells us that he had composed that before 1774. And timing is of interest to me because I want to draw to a close now by speculating on the extent to which the American War of Independence, or rebellion, as I prefer to think of it, may have darkened Gibbon's view of commerce. So as a Member of Parliament, and also from 1779 as a member of the Board of Trade, which was the body set up to administer the American colonies, Gibbon had a ringside seat for this conflict, which came to depress him intensely. This wasn't simply, I think, because the war went badly for the mother country. It was rather because the deployment of British troops to enforce the will of a headstrong administration showed him that despite the optimism of Robertson and Hume and Adam Smith, commerce might supply the casus belli of future conflicts rather than inhibiting their occurrence. In an imperial context, commerce might lose its character of mildness and itself become a motive for oppressive government. Philosophical hopes that liberty and empire might be reconciled, both theoretically and historically, within the discourse of political economy, and that there was a substantial difference between a commercial oceanic empire held together by laws of trade, such as the British Empire, and a land empire held together by a standing army which patrolled its frontiers and was garrisoned at its internal neuralgic points, such as the Roman Empire. Those hopes were dealt a severe blow by the events of 1776 to 1783. History had taught Gibbon that in the past, when the principles of trade were little understood, commerce had paradoxically stoked the fires of warfare. In the 13th century, had not the republics of Venice and Genoa disputed in the first of their naval wars, as he put it, the command of the sea and the commerce of the East. But he must have hoped that his own age had grasped the principles of commercial society more securely and had mastered its intrinsic logic more thoroughly. Yet, as he reviewed the social war between Britain and her American colonies, he would have been forced to acknowledge that there was not perhaps a wide and deep a chasm between the Europe of his own times and the Europe of the centuries he'd studied and described in The Decline and Fall. The dismaying insights precipitated by this war, I think, percolated through into the later volumes of The Decline and Fall, where they offered support for Gibbon's more sceptical, less idealistic, and less philosophical understanding of the role played by commerce in the sequences of human history. Thank you.
Your question?
Of course, yes, of course, yes. Yeah.
So it was a wonderful talk. I very much appreciate it. I wonder if I might get you to just talk a little bit about might get you to talk a little bit about the theme or the thought that underlies it, because it struck me that in a way it was almost a critique of the theme of the conference, right? All this commercial republicanism, Hume and Smith and all these people seem to be a certain naivete or a certain enthusiasm about commerce that Gibbon, in this somewhat skeptical realist mode, seems to think is somewhat foolish or overstated. And I wonder if you could amplify that a little bit or talk about it. Is that your view of Hume and Smith, or is that correct?
I think you've understood me very well, and it's a very good question. I think it's partly a function of mode. So when Hume and Adam Smith are writing about commerce, although they use historical examples, they're not primarily writing as historians. I mean, history is a secondary concern for them. And they're also sort of writing, aren't they, within a kind of mode of stadial theory. So the notion of moving from savagery to pastoral nomadism to agriculture, and eventually reaching the commercial stage. And of course, they know that people have been doing commerce, perhaps throughout that, I mean, in a kind of primitive way, you know, that in Louisiana, when they cut down the tree, you know, there were extra peaches or whatever, and someone, you know, just killed an animal and you could swap some peaches for some meat, and, you know. But what they're really interested in, I think, is what is the sort of radical principle of these societies. So commerce happens, but it's only after, well, when does it happen? Society becomes really commercial, probably later than we think. And in that sense, although I said that, you know, the Gibbon economic life was not a ratchet, for them it is a ratchet. And they're right to see it as a ratchet, because barring some extinction level event, you know, we're not going to get back to, we're not going to renounce commerce. But of course, Gibbon is not writing in a general way. He is writing a very large history, encompassing a great deal of time. But also, interestingly, I think, a period of time when these principles are in a kind of confusion in society. More people, of course, are trying to pursue commerce. But what's interesting is that in doing so, they don't encounter, or their experience is not what William Robertson, in that passage that I quoted from the View of the Progress of Society in Europe, suggests it would be, that, you know, they didn't suddenly find that it was all downhill and easy, and they were suddenly going with the grain. They were not going with the grain. They were cutting across the grain in many ways. And that's why Gibbon, I think, is so interested in those moments when there's some kind of promising, you know, shoot of commercial activity, which goes nowhere, which is crushed or lost. And that the process of history then becomes much more wasteful, I think. The progress of society, he sees, has many more sort of dead ends, aborted moments that were hopeful, but which in the end came to nothing. So he's moving away from, or he's very respectful of these people, and you know, the things he says about Adam Smith in letters are immensely complimentary. In fact, I mean, the whole subject of Gibbon's relationship with Adam Smith is sort of curiously a silence in the scholarship. No one's really written about it, but I mean, it really, I think just because people assume that, you know, they said the same thing, but actually they say slightly different things. Anyway, it's a great subject. If there's a student who is looking for a great subject, then Gibbon and Adam Smith is that. But anyway, so has that clarified a bit what I was saying? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
This was a very, very clear presentation and most interesting. You talked about how the example of antiquity might have caused being actually a historian and looking at antiquity might have made him skeptical about the tout commerce argument. And then about the experiences of his time, you just mentioned now, but you sort of mentioned in passing Rousseau. And I just wonder if you think he might have had any kind of influence on him as it kind of made him ambivalent about commerce.
Right. No, I mean, I don't think that there's any shred of sympathy for Rousseau given. And it's rare that one can say something so unequivocally clear.
You don't have to like somebody to.
No. I mean, well, he didn't like Rousseau. I mean, he didn't like Rousseau. There was a very good personal reason why he didn't like Rousseau. When in the 1750s, Gibbon had struck up a romance that went nowhere with Suzanne Curchod, and he broke it off, and Rousseau later commented very harshly on Gibbon's sort of weakness of will and his willingness to do what his father told him to do in that respect. I think quite justly. I think there's something to be said for Rousseau in that. But I mean, Gibbon knew about that, and that really did irritate him. But I think there was also, I mean, I think that Gibbon also was not prone to idealize primitive society in the way that Rousseau sometimes does. And certainly I think that Gibbon had no desire to pursue a life of agriculture. I mean, to some extent, I mean, he had to, because the family estates in Hampshire were a farm. I mean, not that Gibbon did any farming, of course, but his experience of farming was that it wasn't very productive, and they were throwing money away, and he wanted just to be upstairs in the library. Why did he have to go to these meetings with tenants? It was all very tedious. Shouldn't we just put the money in the stocks? It's so much easier way. Anyway, so he has no sort of temperamental sympathy for that. But I think that Gibbon is not at all skeptical about commerce in his own day. I mean, he subscribes 300% to Hume's view about commerce in the 18th century, that it's what makes life tolerable and enjoyable. What he can't do is say that it had operated in that way in antiquity. And I think that he doesn't take pleasure, actually, particularly in these moments when the economic life of antiquity is sort of throwing up problematic evidence for the Scottish philosophy. In some ways, he'd like it more if it just corroborated it. And one of the interesting things, actually, which I'm going to talk about and might write about at some point, is that in the first volume, published in 1776, he is much more of a textbook Humean about commerce than he is later. And that's, I think, not just because, or not at all, because he is less impressed by Hume's thought. He remains hugely impressed by Hume. It's just that the evidence doesn't back it up in the way that he thought it did to begin with. So that's what it's about. I think there's a reluctant skepticism. I mean, he's not taking pleasure in this sort of disconfirmation of Scottish philosophy by the past.
I thank you. I have two questions. I'd just like you to flesh out a couple of remarks. So one of the passages that you quoted from Hume, he said, in the age which preceded the fall of the Republic, it was computed that there were only 2,000 people of independent means. Is he making an argument here about the connection of economics and politics, that Republican government requires a certain number of people who are independent, self-reliant, and like that? That's the first question.
Right.
And the second question, could you say a little bit more about the essay you referred to at the end of your talk, in which Gibbon was, I wasn't clear, was he actually writing on the American Rebellion, or is it just the remarks that what he was writing was inspired by that?
Right. First point then about that passage from Gibbon where he's talking about how in the last ages of the Republic, property was concentrated in relatively few hands. I mean that I think is an argument about one of the factors that led to the collapse of the Republic, which it would have been very familiar to Gibbon. I mean, in fact, that's not a bit of the past that he's writing about, but I think that he would have had no trouble in seeing that as a factor which had led the Republic to become unstable, and obviously was much better from a Republican point of view when property was more evenly spread throughout society. So I think that's quite right. My sort of coda, talking about the American War, Gibbon never writes in Decline and Fall about the American War directly. It's going on all the time. I mean, read his letters. He will be talking about composing the Decline and Fall at the same time as he's talking to his correspondents about how dreadfully things are going in America. And why is it that we can't convert military dominance into political power? And, so all these issues are actually fascinating from the point of view of the Decline and Fall. It used to be thought that the Decline and Fall was some kind of parallel history to the decline of the British Empire. Completely nothing to support that. It's not some kind of encrypted version of the decline of the British Empire. But because it isn't sort of parallel history, I think it doesn't mean that there isn't an influence passing from the events that he's having to deal with in Parliament every day, and then when he gets home in the evening, or actually in the morning, he would then be writing about when he's composing the later volumes of the history. So what I'm just speculating on there, and that's very speculative, was just, how might that have influenced his views about commerce, in particularly given his seat on the Board of Trade. And my view is that, one of the depressing things about that conflict would have been that it would have shifted his otherwise optimistic view about commerce, that a commercial empire was different from a despotic empire. Actually, not so much. Not so much. When push comes to shove, not so much. You'll still send regiments over there. Does that clarify a bit?
Yeah. So he didn't write an essay, a separate
No,
essay on that.
no,
right?
he didn't,
It's in
no.
the letters.
Yes, that's where you find out what he thinks about the American Revolution, or in his memoirs.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
But thank you for your talk. I don't know if it's nice to know that we economists have a long history of overclaiming and inaccurately predicting, but it was amusing to learn that. My question is whether Gibbon found any contradiction or talked about the commerce in human beings, like as how does that do all the wonderful things that he said commerce would do?
Right. Well, that's an excellent question, and I think that one of the really fascinating aspects of this whole subject is how commerce in its broader sense relates to commerce in its narrow sense. How just interaction relates to trade, because trade is just one kind of interaction. And as I say, Gibbon uses the word commerce in Decline and Fall to refer to all sorts of interactions, of all sorts of different kinds. And the reason he does that, I think, is because he does want us to think that there is some sort of continuity between these things. So what is that? Well, I think again what it comes down to is the benefits of hybridization. That one of the factors which, as Gibbon sees it, held people back was the confinement of people within, as it were, silos of any kind, you know. So it could be a geographical silo, could be an ideological silo, could be a religious silo. That these silos are unhelpful and hold people back. So I think that trade is obviously one way of breaking that down, just geographical movement of people. And of course, in that sense as well, I mean, one of the sort of natural processes whereby empire undoes itself is that it too is a mechanism for mixing things up. So Gibbon talks in the early survey chapters of Decline and Fall about how the Roman Empire had gathered together peoples, products, languages, religions from all around the Mediterranean and had to mix them up. And that in itself, I mean, may have loosened the possibility of maintaining empire as a sort of political entity. So, I mean, those are the kinds of issue that I think I want to bring up, thinking about interaction in the framework of commerce and trade. But was that the kind of thing that you were asking?
I was thinking more about slavery.
Right.
And about how when the product of trade is a human being, it seems to like raise all kinds of horrors, contradictions, whatever words you want to use. So while I get the claims for trade that folks have about breaking down the silos and giving all kinds of benefits to specialization and exchange and all of that, it seems that there's this other side.
Sure. Well, let me say something about Gibbon and slavery. So he's against it, and he's against it in both its ancient and its modern forms. But he thinks that the modern form is infinitely worse than the ancient form. And how does he distinguish those two things? So ancient slavery, firstly, doesn't have a racial characteristic. Anyone can be a slave. That has no relation to colour of skin. Slaves in the ancient world were typically captives, people who've been unlucky enough to lose. I mean, you know, if we still had ancient slavery in 1783, now I would be your slave now, probably. Sorry? So there was no particular, there was no racial aspect to it. There was no particular infamy either attaching to it. And one of the things that Gibbon brings out in the practice of ancient slavery is how slaves would occupy very responsible, very technical positions within a household. They would be doctors. They would have extremely responsible jobs. They would run estates. So they were obnoxious in the technical sense that they could be punished at will, they could be sold, their offspring became also the property of their master until they were freed. They could be freed, and at that point, you know, a freedman was a Roman citizen, so you could escape the condition of slavery. Modern slavery, of course, is different. It's not a product of warfare, it's a trade, it has a racial characteristic. And Gibbon finds it morally repugnant. And another row he has with his friend Lord Sheffield is precisely over slavery. So Sheffield is an enthusiastic slaver. He didn't have West Indian estates, but he is a resolute defender of the practice of slavery. Gibbon, the interesting letters. In fact, he also writes a pamphlet in defense of the slave trade. There are interesting letters between Gibbon and Sheffield, in which Gibbon lays out all the evidence, really, for the moral repugnancy of
But it
modern
doesn't
slavery.
get into questions placed about trade.
Well, I mean, he subscribes to Smith's view about slavery, that slavery is about the most wasteful form of economic production that you could possibly come up with. I mean, he is fully modern in that way. So, from that point of view, I mean, he is genuinely puzzled by the persistence of modern slavery. Why should it? I mean, it's not economically beneficial. So why did it continue? He certainly doesn't see it as being economically useful. Either, well, I mean, it was economically useful in antiquity, I think, but it was less in ways. He sees it as, he takes a Smith line on modern slavery that is pointless, really, as well as being revolting. Yeah.
David, I'd like to have you say a little bit more about distinctions that you find in Gibbon between commerce and pre-commercial society, and the character or quality of commerce in what we take to be, or Smith would have thought was a commercial society, that there's something qualitatively different. That through the ages there have been trucking and bartering, but there's something about the nature of contract that changes the nature of commerce. We talk about interactions, but this is very much a transactional society.
Yeah.
In the wake of the Bank of England Act and the beginnings of the regulation of the stock market, commerce becomes a thing that can be stabilized in a way that it wasn't in the past, that it's lost in simple trades that are then gone. Does he introduce the discourse of law and jurisprudence and the expansion of civil contract into his account of commerce?
Not quickly scanning 6 volumes in my mind. Not that I can bring immediately to mind, but I think that I think that's a great question and goes right to the heart of the whole subject. So I think that what Gibbon finds is that there is something about despotic political systems which is profoundly inimical to commercial society, and that's the point really about that moment when he alludes to Montesquieu and despotism and cutting the tree to eat the fruit. That in despotic governments, the temptation, to cut the tree to eat the fruit is almost irresistible, and that it takes a very long time to educate monarchs that by repudiating their debts, actually you get transient relief, but then no one will ever lend you money ever again, or they'll only lend you money at usurious rates of interest.
But that's a political problem, not a commercial problem.
It's a political problem, but it becomes then a commercial problem, because how can you pursue commerce? How can commerce thrive in a society where the sort of the natural tendency of commerce is always being thwarted by a political crosscurrent that will suppress and discourage commerce?
Can I just follow up with that?
Yeah.
So then 1776 as a date for both decline and fall, the American Revolution, and wealth of nations. Is this...
And huge debt.
And, well, here we are. But
Get the point here.
is the East India Company the go-to machine to some degree? So that despotic power, whether it's exclusively political or commercial, is about a form of monopoly, that empire is a form of political monopoly, that when he's seen from the
I think that what happens is that when an empire thrives, it breaks the bounds of an empire. It's a commercial empire, and what the British found in the 1770s was that whatever happened on the battlefield, and actually, I give us points win on the battlefield. Actually, in the American War of Independence, until we surrendered. Whatever happens on the battlefield, I mean, when the mass of trade in the colonies is greater than trade of the mother country, there's no way that can be sustained. Now, there are very. The other thing, of course, that is relevant to all this is the circulation of information. Information is starting to circulate. If you look at some of Burke's speeches in the 1770s on the conflict with the colonies, huge amounts of data about trade, and the quality of data as well has improved out of all recognition from 1650 onwards, let's say. There's a very interesting, one of the books that I mentioned that Gibbon uses when he's writing about trade is Adam Anderson's History of Commerce. Fascinating book, but now forgotten and neglected book. But there's a long section in the introduction there where he just talks about how the quality of statistics has improved out of all recognition from the mid and late 17th century onwards. That people were still making errors in estimating population of several orders of magnitude. Saying that France had a population of 80 million. Well, in the 16th century, and population 80 million in the 16th century.
David, pardon my ignorance, but who was Anderson? Adam Anderson.
Adam Anderson was secretary of the East India Company, and he worked in mid 18th century, and he writes a 2-volume History of Commerce, published in 1764. Massive work, and very interesting, and written, of course, as well by someone who understood the workings of the mid 18th century commercial economy, had a command of detail that I think a few other people had at the time. So it's really well worth looking at, I think.
David, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
And I think it goes to Zarko.
Okay, great.
It's about one of your shortest quotations.
Very much.
Not short, 22, which in itself is very interesting because it puts war and commerce and religious zeal together as propagators of technology. Then I looked up most of that chapter, and I think I see Gibbon's enthusiasm there and idealism. He acquiesces to a pleasing conclusion that from now on, the real wealth and happiness and knowledge, perhaps virtue, will be unstoppable. And the barbarians, in order to conquer us in Europe, they have to become civilized. There's no way around it. Look at Russia. The science of war necessarily goes with the art of peace, etc. So it seems like maybe he's skeptical about commerce, but at least in that chapter, and his representative, he's really gaga over technology.
Yeah, okay. So that is the conclusion of the general observations here on the fall of the Roman Empire in West, which he puts at the end of volume 3, but which he has drafted before 1774. He tells us. You could be nitpicky about that because in parts of that section there are footnotes which refer to events which post-date 1774. Some of the expeditions to the South Sea Islands, for instance, which happened in the late 1770s. So but my feeling is that he's basically telling the truth. He wrote that. He wrote the base text before 1774, and when he prints it, he adds details which come later to it. But the point about the optimism is, of course, that at that point, I think he is much more of a textbook Humean And at that point as well, he hasn't started the hard work on the sort of 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, which will generate most of the sort of details that suddenly cloud or challenge that Scottish philosophical picture about how commerce operates in all societies. It's only when he's sort of really researching that in the late 1770s that I think he's encountering this sort of contradictory material when he's in his academic work, his historical work, just at the same time as in the House of Commons, he is experiencing, on the Board of Trade, he's experiencing how commerce, even in his own day, can start to veer away from the Scottish philosophical model. So, anyway.
Please join me in thanking. We continue tomorrow morning in room 720 of this building, which is exactly 5 floors above us, and Professor Thomas Merrill of American University will be speaking on Hume on commerce. And Professor Merrill has just within the last half year published a book on David Hume, so he knows of that which he speaks. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you.
Sir. Hello, nice to meet you. Heroes. Yeah. Unfortunately, spent $99. Why don't I ask
Yes, I've got it. It's debatable. Actually, right, I'm going to say somebody's going to have to go price for this argument, right?
Several travels, Rich, talked about just go right across the river, exact same terrain, but it's a free state, so things are built up, thriving.
It's correlation, it's not causation. Yes.
Did you enjoy it?
Several years ago, I was